By the end of this week's readings, we've met the main cast of characters in Luke's second book, the Acts of the Apostles. The cast, as they appear in order, are as follows. Acts 2, Peter preaches his first sermon to the crowd on the day of Pentecost. Acts 3, Peter and John, who of course were numbered among the 12 who were with Jesus, are teaching and healing in the temple courts, which ultimately lands them in prison by the same people who put Jesus on the cross. Acts 4, Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, you know him better as Barnabas, who will later become Paul's missionary companion in Acts chapter 11. Acts 6 and 7, Stephen, one of the 7 deacons, he becomes the first Christian martyr. Acts 8, Philip, another of the 7 deacons, scattered by the persecution, Philip becomes the evangelist to Samaria and Caesarea. Acts 9, Saul, the persecutor of the disciples of Jesus, becomes Paul, the proclaimer of Christ to the nations. Acts 12, John Mark, missionary companion with Paul, and later Barnabas' missionary companion. Acts 15, Silas, who will be a missionary companion to Paul and end up with Paul in prison at Philippi. That's the cast of characters. And here's the timeline of Acts. Admittedly, there is not 100% agreement among biblical historians as to the starting and ending dates of this book. Yet, even though there's variety in the timelines offered, most agree the book spans 30 plus years, give or take. What we know for certain is the start time in Acts chapter 1, which begins with the ascension of Christ 40 days after his resurrection. I personally am an advocate for 33 AD as the year of Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection, which puts the ending date of this book somewhere between 65 and 70 AD. Now, think about how much time is covered by so few words, especially when compared with the 4 Gospels that span only 3 years. And in the Gospel of John, 7 chapters 13 through 19, cover a 24-hour day, a single day in Christ's life. Well, let's walk through the timeline of the book of Acts based on a starting year of 33 AD. So 33 to 35 AD, chapters 1 through chapter 8, verse 5, covers 2 years. Now there's agreement that the first 7 chapters of Acts span about 2 years, from the ascension of Christ through the stoning of Stephen and the start of Christian persecution. I include the first 5 verses of chapter 8 also in those first 2 years. 36 to 50 AD, Acts chapters 9 through 12, is about a 14-year period. Persecution is started. Saul is converted. Somewhere in between Acts 9 verse 19 through 26, Paul spends an unknown amount of time in Arabia receiving revelation from Jesus Christ. Paul writes about that in Galatians chapter 1. Then, in that same section, Peter preaches to the Gentiles. Barnabas is sent to Antioch. Peter is also imprisoned. Acts 51 to 52, Paul's first missionary journey. Barnabas then is Paul's companion. 52 to 55 AD, Acts 16 to 18 covers 3 years of Paul's second missionary journey. This time Silas is his companion. 56 to 61 AD, Acts 19 to 21:17 covers Paul's third missionary journey, 5 years. Our readings this week, Acts 14 through 19, overlap the end of Paul's first missionary journey, cover the entire second missionary journey, and the beginning of the third missionary journey. Now, here's what was a revelation for me. Follow all of Paul's footsteps on a map, and you have to be amazed at how far he traveled. The first missionary journey of Paul began in Antioch. Antioch was really his home base for his missionary journeys. From Antioch in his first journey, they traveled by foot to Seleucia, about a 10 to 12 mile trip, where they got on a boat and sailed to the island of Cyprus, about an 80-mile trip by boat. The two cities on the island of Cyprus were Salmis and Paphos, on the eastern, respectively, and western ends, about 65 miles apart. From Paphos, they sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, a 90-mile trip by boat. It was in Perga that John Mark left them. They walked through the mountains of Pisidia to the city of Antioch, a treacherous trip of 50 mountainous miles. From there, they traveled to Iconium, another 35 to 40 miles. From there, they traveled to Lystra, 20 miles, and from there to Derbe, 40 miles. And from Derbe, they traveled back, all the way back the same track, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Pisidian Antioch, Perga, Attalia, where they boarded a ship to Seleucia and then walked that 10-12 mile home back to Antioch, home base. Now, if you take out the travel by ship, there is a total of 385 miles by foot that Paul walked with Barnabas in their first missionary journey, which, when you average it over a year's time, is only about a mile a day. But that's not the whole story. That's the simple part of the story. The more complex part, or the litany that Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, speaks about all the troubles that Paul had while he was on his various missionary journeys. Here's what he writes in 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 28. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. We read about that in our readings in Derbe. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardships, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. How did Paul survive? He survived, he admits, by God's grace alone. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10. But he, the Lord, said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.